Militants from the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant invade parts of Iraq's Kirkuk and Salah ad-Din provinces after occupying the second city of Mosul. Iraq's Prime Minister declares a nationwide state of emergency, saying that the government is prepared to counter the terrorist offensive. The death toll from the ongoing infighting between rival militant groups in Syria climbs to over 600. And the Israeli Knesset approves a law enabling the forced feeding of Palestinian hunger-striking detainees. Hello there, you're watching Ali Tijah World News and I'm Fatima Basim. Hundreds of militants from the Al-Qaeda-affiliated group, the Islamic State in Iraq and Levant, have overrun the country's second largest city of Mosul. Militants also occupied several areas in the Kirkuk and Salah ad-Din provinces, dealing a serious blow to Baghdad's efforts to control a widening insurgency in the country.
3 days of bloody fighting in the northern city of Mosul has gone from bad to worse for government forces, and the district that is the provincial capital of the Nineveh province has now fallen to Al-Qaeda militants in Iraq. Hundreds of gunmen took control of key portions of Mosul on Tuesday morning, freeing over 1,000 inmates from the central prison, which observers believe could lead to a further deterioration in security. Hundreds of families were seen fleeing the city and waiting in their vehicles at Kurdish checkpoints west of Arbil. Insurgents have also seized several areas in the country's Kirkuk and Salah ad-Din provinces, both located north of Baghdad. Soldiers and police reportedly abandoned their posts, while others were apparently ordered to depart, allowing militants to move in and raise their flags. Police and local officials said the militants were using cranes to move blast walls into position and block roads to prevent the army from regaining control. While several army officers said Iraqi forces were demoralized and no match for the militants, who are also active across the border in Syria, other religious figures such as the prominent Shia cleric Sayyid Ali Sistani issued this handwritten letter calling on all political parties to cooperate with the government. Meanwhile, Iraq's Speaker of Parliament, Hussam al-Nujayfi, called on all the country's armed forces to intensify their shelling against militants.
I call on the army to intensify their shelling on militants. They must not allow them to advance anymore. I call on the men of Mosul to stand firm in their areas and defend their neighborhoods against the outsiders, and to form popular committees through the Provincial Council.
With all factions in the country calling for unity in this fight against the militants, the coming days will be crucial in determining the country's future and whether it can withstand this latest wave of attacks by the insurgents.
Meanwhile, twin blasts went off near a funeral procession in the Iraqi city of Baquba, killing 20 people. The blasts in the capital of Diyala province, north of Baghdad, also wounded 28 people, according to local sources. Let's now speak to our Baghdad correspondent, Wissam al-Bayati. Wissam, if you can tell us more about the government's efforts to defeat ISIL militants.
Yes, in fact, the first step has been taken by the Iraqi government is to intensify the presence of the Iraqi security forces, especially the Iraqi special forces and the anti-terrorism troops across the Iraqi capital. And they have actually tripleized the presence of these forces in and around the heavy fortified Iraqi green zone where the Iraqi political process is taking place. At the same time, the Iraqi forces have been actually high alerted in the areas nearby the province of Salah ad-Din and Mosul, especially Kirkuk, as most of the Kurdish troops, Peshmerga, have moved actually towards the hills of Hamrin and even nearby the city of Kirkuk to prevent any further of spillover of the militants to the Kurdistan regional government. In fact, what it has happened, and according to the description of most of the security experts, they say that the attacks took place and the occupation of the ISIL militants took place in Mosul, while the Iraqi security forces have actually intensified their presence in the outskirts of the city of Fallujah, and while they were conducting military operations in the city of Ramadi to impose the law and order over there after the militants took over on the several villages in the desert of Anbar. But at the same time, according to the statement of the Iraqi Prime Minister, who have actually called on the Iraqi Parliament to approve and give the green light for the emergency law, has been actually responded by the Parliament, as the Iraqi Speaker of the Parliament have actually announced the approval of the lawmakers to hold a session, emergency session, to discuss the proposal of the Iraqi Prime Minister and its consequences. Yes.
Yes, and what more can you tell us about ISIL militants controlling parts of the Salahuddin province?
Well, in fact, the situation in Salahuddin province is chaotic, as most of the residents, including some people who I have actually personally know, they have fled the city and they have actually moved to the neighboring provinces, especially the Kurdistan regional government. In addition to the eyewitnesses have actually said that the ISIL militants have raided most of the banks and even the other governmental facilities, and they have actually started to loot the money and all the other properties which belongs to the Iraqi government and even the ordinary people, as they have actually started to steal the goldsmiths and most of the precious instruments and even gold and the other jewelry. Yes.
All right, Wissam Al-Bayati, our Iraq correspondent, thank you for giving us the latest. Well, that attack on the country's second largest city has prompted Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki to declare a state of emergency in Mosul during a public statement broadcast on state television.
First, the Council of Ministers decided to declare the state of high alert and mobilize all efforts to face up to the existing challenges. Second, the seriousness of the security situation needs immediate and swift measures to preserve the national security and people. And this needs the Prime Minister and the Presidential Office to ask the Parliament to shoulder its responsibilities and declare a state of emergency and general mobilization.
The Iraqi Premier has also said that the government was well prepared to counter the recent offensive by terrorist groups in Nainawa, adding that a special crisis cell was being set up by his cabinet.
I announced general mobilization and total readiness to all powers, political, financial and popular, to stop the terrorism and bring life back to normal in the areas controlled by the terrorists in Mosul and any other city that they might be in. We will not allow for Nainawa and Mosul to be under the shadows of terror and terrorists. The cabinet prepared for all the needed authorizations and all of the financial needs. It created a special unit called the Crisis Unit to follow up on the operations of gathering and preparing and arming and planning and taking all needed steps.
The international community has condemned the violence in Iraq. For its part, Tehran said that the spread of violence in Iraq is a flagrant example of the transnational threat of terrorism. Meanwhile, the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon expressed a grave concern about the militant takeover of Mosul, calling on Iraq's political leaders to unite in the face of threats. Washington also weighed in, vowing to support the Iraqi government.
These kinds of solutions don't have a solely, or these kinds of challenges don't have a solely military solution. So while we can provide important military assistance to improve the security situation in Iraq, addressing these challenges is going to require a commitment by the Iraqi leadership, including Prime Minister Maliki, to confront the kinds of unresolved issues that are facing all of the people in Iraq.
Well, the recent gains by the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant cannot be attributed to a single factor. The following report takes a look at both the internal and external dynamics driving the violence in Iraq.
At a time when Lockheed Martin is delivering its first batch of F-16 fighter jets to Iraq, aimed at boosting the country's ability to defend its vast borders, the security situation is causing a state of hysteria amid nationwide bombings and armed assaults. The chaos is apparent as violent attacks carried out by militant groups, including the Al-Qaeda offshoot of the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, have spread throughout Iraq. The ISIL is trying to extend its influence across areas experiencing deteriorating security. The militant group has thus far taken control of Diyala, Salahuddin, Kirkuk, and recently Nainawa province. The group is also trying to lift the siege on the embattled city of Fallujah, where the Iraqi army is currently undertaking military operations. Some analysts link the armed escalation to internal factors, including those related to the formation of the next Iraqi government and the failure to form alliances. Some party leaders, unable to overcome political differences, adopted armed groups as a means to pressure other blocs. Meanwhile, other analysts point to regional agendas and external factors, including the situation in Syria. The recent setbacks for the ISIL in Syria's Deir ez-Zor, where militant infighting has killed hundreds of insurgents, may have diverted the group's attention back to Iraq. In addition, the Iraqi Prime Minister Nour al-Maliki blamed Saudi Arabia and Qatar for the security crisis and a spike in terrorism across his country. The fall of Mosul and other cities in the country suggests that the Iraqi state is facing an existential challenge, as regional and global agendas unite with local insurgencies to undermine Baghdad's government.
Political analyst Zaid Isa joins us now from London. Mr. Isa, why was it easy, or it seemed to be relatively easy, for ISIL militants to take over Mosul? Has it revealed just how weak the Iraqi army is?
No, I mean, I don't think it suggests that or clearly indicates that the Iraqi army was absolutely weak. But there are a number of factors at play here. I mean, one of the main factors is that the American administration hasn't put its money where its mouth is. That is, when push came to shove, it has been dragging its feet. It has been having cold feet about arming the Iraqi army, supplying it with the latest technology. It has been refusing to do that because it wants to punish the Iraqi government, particularly Maliki, for actually not helping out and stationing 5,000 to 10,000 American forces on the ground, and for the Iraqi army adamantly refusing to actually provide the Americans with the immunity of prosecution that they actually demanded to stay in Iraq. That's one reason. So the Americans want to use their weapon actually to regain to regain and bolster their waning influence in Iraq. The second factor is actually an internal thing, the internal squabbling, particularly led by the political blocs, which have been steadfastly determined to severely undermine a third term for Maliki, and this is led by Muttahidun, which is led by Osama al-Nujayfi. We've seen Osama al-Nujayfi widely vilifying and widely demonizing the Iraqi army and trying to totally discredit that army, calling into question its legitimacy, accusing it of being a tool in the hands of Maliki. And he has adamantly refused to acknowledge that those who have occupied Fallujah and Ramadi are actually Al-Qaeda. He went out of his way by traveling to the States, and as well as another leader, which is Masoud al-Barazani, who is actually now a leader of what is coming close to a totally independent state, traveling to the States, demanding that no arms should be supplied to the Iraqi army because it is totally a discredited army that do not represent the Iraqi army, accusing it of having a sectarian agenda. The other factor, which is actually the most crucial factor, is the torrent of arming, funding, logistical support, and even the unprecedented step of actually supplying salaries to thousands of Wahhabi Salafi mercenaries converging on Syria and bolstering the al-Nusra Front, which according to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi has stated last year, it's nothing but part and parcel of Al-Qaeda in Iraq and simply an extension of Al-Qaeda Iraq, and its leader, one of the foot soldiers of Al-Qaeda. And Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi has actually acknowledged that all those arms and funding have actually been shared by the two terrorist organizations, which is something that the New York Times have acknowledged, that all these weapons and armament from Saudi Arabia
as you mentioned there,
found its way to the most extremist groups in Syria and Iraq.
As you mentioned there, Osama Nujayfi has been a staunch critic of the operations in Anbar, but now he's saying that he wants the army to intensify its shellings against ISIL. Has there been a change of heart?
Well, I mean, apparently, from what we hear from him, out of the blue, and all of a sudden, he made a huge U-turn and a major change of heart. Now, he is actually pleading for the backing of the central government. He is asserting that now is the time to put all the differences aside and to actually unite to confront again the terrorist organization. He did not mention Al-Qaeda by name, but he said that there is an external invasion. So he's acknowledging now for the first time that those who have occupied Anbar and now occupying Mosul are simply outsiders, foreigners, and it is an army coming and supported by outsiders. And he's acknowledging that there are countries, without naming names, obviously, because he is still adamantly refusing and defiantly refusing to actually name Saudi Arabia and Qatar for being actually the main supporters and the chief supporters behind the resurgence of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. The Al-Qaeda in Iraq was reeling. It was on the back foot, and it was all due to the change of strategy. Look, I mean, let me tell you, the main strategy of Saudi Arabia was actually to support the al-Nusra and to actually convince Al-Qaeda, where the leadership of Al-Qaeda the Saudis have great influence there, to actually shift their emphasis and to turn Syria into their main battleground, arguing that the fall of the Syrian regime would simply mean that Iraq will crumble because it will break the backbone of Iraq, when they actually spectacularly failed and their strategy spectacularly backfired in Syria, and the Syrian army is making major headways in different areas. We've seen that there has been a tremendous shift, a seismic shift in strategy, turning their focus as well as in Syria, also shifting their strategy to encompass Iraq as well, arguing that it is essential to break the backbone of Iraq, discredit Iraq and derail the political process, destabilize Iraq, with the ultimate goal of dismantling the entire political process or the fledgling democracy in Iraq. And that's their main answer to the successful voting that has taken place, and also to the fact that Maliki has actually, against all the odds, have made a commanding seismic lead in actually the election and on the verge of actually forming the new government in Iraq. And that's why we see a dramatic intensification, a dramatic escalation in the operation carried out by Al-Qaeda, and moving a strategy from Iraq and simply targeting Shia areas in order to provoke a response from the overwhelming majority of Iraqis who happen to be Shias, and to actually push the country towards an internal civil war, or to push it back to the brink of another civil war that Iraq has avoided in the 2006 and 2007. The other factor which has played into that is actually the protests and the demonstrations, which were actually wholeheartedly endorsed by the Saudi administration, with the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia explicitly saying that Iraq will not find stability, Iraq will remain unstable and insecure as long as there is discrimination and there is sidelining of one important component, and that is the Sunni, which basically doesn't hold any water, this argument, because we have the same strategy of Al-Qaeda during the rule of Iyad Allawi, during the rule of Al-Jafari, and this issue about discrimination doesn't hold any water, because the Sunnis have been given ample opportunity to participate in the government. They have 9 highly prominent positions in the government, One of them is the Deputy Prime Minister, Vice President to the country, and 8 other ministries, which is not the case in Saudi Arabia, where the Shias are exposed to violent,
all right, I'm going to have to leave it there, Mr. Isa. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on this. Fighting is raging in eastern Syria, namely in the oil-rich province of Deir ez-Zor, as rival militant groups, one rooted in neighboring Iraq and the other in Syria, refresh their objective of creating an independent emirate of their own. The fighting between the two groups has left over 600 people dead during the last few weeks.
Death and decay is all one can smell in the eastern province of Deir ez-Zor, as the energy-rich province continues to suffer ongoing clashes that threaten the lives of the remaining residents. The latest round of violence between the Al-Qaeda offshoot ISIL and Al-Nusra Front in Deir ez-Zor have claimed the lives of at least 45 militants from both sides. The Al-Nusra Front and other Al-Qaeda affiliate groups recaptured Al-Qarada oil station in southeast Deir ez-Zor after violent clashes with ISIL, while in the town of Kasham, in the eastern countryside of Deir ez-Zor, ISIL have managed to assert control over Al-Kasham oil field in what appears to be an ongoing campaign by ISIL to assert control over the province's natural resources mines. But ISIL paid little notice to the suffering of Al-Kasham residents, not only forcing them to flee in fear, but video footage which has been uploaded online shows ISIL militants fire live mortar rounds at frightened civilians. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Many have questioned what caused ISIL to step up its offensive against rival insurgents, but analysts have attributed ISIL's campaign to its aspirations of an Islamic State extending from Deir ez-Zor to Raqqa province, the only province under the notorious group's control. Other reports suggest that during this campaign, ISIL have asserted control over 7 additional villages around Deir ez-Zor. ISIL's gains came after a militant group called Council of Mujahideen retreated from the region in an unexpected move. Since the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant launched a new offensive in Deir ez-Zor province 40 days ago, 634 people, mainly fighters, have been killed, and more than 100,000 people have been forced to flee in fear for their lives, as the systematic crimes carried out by militant groups active in the province continue unabated.
In line with a decree issued by Syrian President Bashar al-Assad granting general amnesty for all crimes except acts of terrorism, authorities began releasing prisoners from government jails. According to local sources, dozens of inmates have been freed from Adra prison since the decree was issued. Syria's Justice Minister said that the decree is aimed at boosting national unity and improving coexistence in the society. President Vladimir Putin held talks with the Saudi Foreign Minister Saud al-Faisal as both countries appear to step up dialogue over the war in Syria. The Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov announced Putin and Saudi Arabia's top diplomat met several weeks ago, refusing to say where the encounter took place or what was discussed. Saudi Arabia has been a key backer of militant groups in Syria, while Russia is a staunch supporter of President Bashar al-Assad's government. You're watching AEE TV World News, still to come. Yemen is plunged into darkness following a militant attack on the country's power grid. Welcome back to Ali Tijah World News. Here's a reminder of our top stories. Militants from the Islamic State in Iraq and Levant invade parts of Iraq's Kirkuk and Salah ad-Din provinces after occupying the second city of Mosul. Iraq's Prime Minister declares a nationwide state of emergency, saying that the government is prepared to counter the terrorist offensive. The death toll from the ongoing infighting between rival militant groups in Syria climbs to over 600. And the Israeli Knesset approves the law enabling the forced feeding of Palestinian hunger-striking detainees. The Israeli regime has given initial approval to a law enabling the forced feeding of some 300 Palestinian hunger-striking prisoners. The move has drawn fierce criticism from human rights activists who say that it would not deter the inmates.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's government has moved to allow forced feeding of Palestinian hunger strikers, setting off a fiery defiance from activists and doctors' associations who contend that doing so is tantamount to torture. Some 290 Palestinians are currently on a hunger strike, protesting against administrative detention, meaning the imprisonment of Palestinians by Israeli occupation forces without trial or charge. More than 120 of the hunger strikers have been refusing food since April 24th. While the Israeli prison service says 65 inmates have been taken to hospitals, Palestinian groups have put the number of those requiring medical care at 78. The UN has intervened and called for all the inmates held under administrative detention to either be released or charged without delay. The United Nations Human Rights Office further condemned the practice of forced feeding and classifies it as a form of torture. Forced feeding is considered a grave breach of World Medical Association's guidelines on treatment of hunger strikers. In 1980, 2 Palestinians died when Israelis attempted to force feed them during a previous hunger strike. With more than 5,000 Palestinians reportedly being held in Israeli prisons, nearly 200 of them under administrative detention orders, these hunger strikers say they are ready to die for their cause.
Meanwhile, the Israeli Knesset has elected Reuven Rivlin, a far-right member of the ruling Likud party, as the 10th president after Shimon Peres steps down next month. Rivlin is a 74-year-old former Speaker of Parliament who has won widespread support from across the political spectrum. He is known for being opposed to a Palestinian state and a keen backer of the illegal Israeli settlements. Well, an Israeli NGO announced that more than 200 illegal settlements have been constructed across the occupied West Bank since 1967. Tens of thousands of hectares of land have so far been seized from the Palestinians for the construction of the settlements, which currently house over 300,000 Israelis. A marathon round of gas talks between Russia, Ukraine and the European Commission ended in Brussels without an agreement over a possible gas cut-off by Moscow to Kiev. Following 8 hours of negotiations, diplomats from all sides said that all points of the deal were negotiated and discussions will resume either late on Tuesday or on Wednesday, adding that parties would now consult with their respective governments.
We have some open questions and some different positions, ongoing different positions, but we agreed to continue to negotiate.
As tensions simmer between Moscow and NATO, the Kremlin has launched military maneuvers in response to war games by the Western military alliance near the Russian border.
Russian first strike forces, Marines, paratroops and long-range bombers unleashed alongside NATO's military maneuvers. flexing its military muscle in the face of double war games conducted by joint NATO forces on the territory of the 3 Baltic states, Russia has launched military drills of its own. The Russian maneuvers involve the use of naval groups, marines, landing operations of airborne forces, air defense training, and firing exercise of frontline aviation. The war games come one day after the Western Alliance launched one of its largest military maneuvers in the former Soviet Baltic states, since tensions with Moscow spiked over Ukraine. Around 4,700 troops and 800 military vehicles from 10 countries, including Britain, Canada, and the United States, are participating in the cyber strike exercises near the Latvian capital Riga. Russia was quick to object to the drills, which it described as an act of aggression. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov also warned that any eastward expansion or build-up by NATO near its borders would backfire. And while few expect these drills to translate into a real military confrontation, the recent spike in tension is likely to result in more muscle-flexing exercises by both sides.
A Bahraini court has handed down jail sentences to 13 pro-democracy activists over charges relating to attacks on police during anti-government demonstrations in 2012. The defendants were detained after protesters clashed with riot police in the village of Sitra outside the capital Manama. They were found guilty of attempted murder of police officers, possession of Molotov cocktails, and gathering on a public highway. The trial is the latest in a string of prosecutions against protesters in the kingdom. EU brokered talks in Geneva aimed at setting the stage for a comprehensive deal over Tehran's nuclear program have ended with no apparent breakthrough. However, the talks have been described as positive. For his part, Iran's President Sheikh Hassan Rouhani said that Tehran would do its best to secure a deal with world powers over the long-running nuclear dispute. The two sides are trying to bridge differences ahead of another round of negotiations between Iran and the 6 world powers.
The second and final day of EU-mediated nuclear talks between Iran and the US has gotten underway in Geneva. Optimism was voiced by more than one side. However, it appears that all progress that has been made will need to continue before a lasting deal is clinched. Just as the case was in each previous round, very few details were revealed. Head of the Iranian negotiating team, Abbas Araghchi, said that Monday's session was held in a positive and constructive climate, indicating that momentum has to be built on. Washington, for its part, said that time is running out and that diplomacy has to intensify to reach a consensus. It also warned that such an agreement cannot be achieved without making some tough choices. Tuesday's negotiations will be followed by a separate meeting between Iranian and the French representatives, as all involved parties agreed that diplomatic efforts will be stepped up ahead of the July 20 deadline.
Bilateral discussions between France and Iran will take place on Wednesday. After these discussions, there will also be discussions between the Iranians and the Russians. There might be others. Anyway, the 3 countries that I know about are the Americans, the Russians, and the French.
Iran's rapprochement with the West has produced some tangible progress that transcends the nuclear issue. Germany has now expressed its willingness to invest in economic projects in Iran, with a German delegation preparing to make the trip to Tehran for what might prove to be a major breakthrough in Iran's West ties.
On the final day of Iranian President Sheikh Hassan Rouhani's trip to Turkey, both Tehran and Ankara have stressed their determination to further promote their bilateral relations on various fronts, particularly in economic, trade and energy sectors.
On the second and final day of Iranian President Sheikh Hassan Rouhani's visit to Turkey, both states stressed their commitment to expanding their cooperation in various fields, namely the economic, trade and energy sectors. In a statement issued following the first meeting of the joint Iran-Turkey Supreme Cooperation Council on Monday, Tehran and Ankara called for the enhancement of their neighborly ties in the areas of mutual interest. The two countries also stressed the need for the expansion of bilateral economic and commercial ties in an effort to bring about prosperity for the two neighboring nations and help boost regional security. Iran and Turkey also pledged to exhaust all efforts to increase the volume of their trade exchanges to some $30 billion over the next 2 years. Tehran and Ankara agreed to strengthen cooperation in the energy sector and tap into all existing potentials to that effect. According to the statement, senior Iranian and Turkish officials also exchanged views on Tehran's nuclear energy program, stressing on the right of Iran and all signatories of the Non-Proliferation Treaty to obtain nuclear technology for peaceful purposes. Meanwhile, both sides also underlined the need for a Middle East free of nuclear weapons. The high-level council described extremism and violence in all forms as one of the most serious threats to international peace and security. During the meeting, which was chaired by President Rouhani and Turkey's Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Iranian and Turkish authorities discussed the latest developments in the Middle East. While deep divisions remain between the two countries over the conflict in Syria, the potential of an Iranian market of 76 million people with some of the world's largest oil and gas reserves is a magnet for Turkish companies.
A Cairo court has sentenced 82 students described as supporters of ousted President Mohamed Morsi to 5 years in prison for staging illegal protests. The defendants were arrested in January and December during protests at Al-Azhar University, the scene of recurrent student-led demonstrations. A graphic video has surfaced showing a gang of men sexually assaulting an Egyptian woman during celebration rallies following the inauguration of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. The incident has shed light on the prevalent epidemic in the Egyptian society.
Women were dancing, cheering and celebrating after former army chief Abdel Fattah al-Sisi was inaugurated as Egypt's new president, bearing promises of stability and security in the country. At the same time, a woman was being assaulted in a dark alley in Cairo, just a few hundred meters away from the rallies. Footage of a woman being sexually assaulted by a mob of men, too graphic to be aired, has been uploaded online. The video showed a group of men preying on the young woman, who was badly bruised. The victim, however, is only one of 9 cases that night, or at least of those that have been reported. Police have arrested only 7 men suspected of being involved in these incidents so far. It has been dubbed sexual terrorism, as rape and all kinds of sexual harassment have become a nationwide epidemic. What's even more shocking, perhaps, is that Egypt had no specific law on sexual harassment before last week, when law amendments were approved, and will see penalties including jail and fines for these offenses. For many women's rights defenders, these measures fall short of addressing the widespread phenomenon. The video awakened latent outrage among Egyptians, with many of them calling for protests. The fact that the incident occurred during a pro-Sisi rally enraged many of his opponents, even though he has expressed solidarity with women.
I will treat all of Egypt's girls as my daughters. It hurts me to know that Egypt's women are subject to harassment in any way.
Some 250 cases of sexual harassment were reported between 2012 and 2013 during protests in the capital, Cairo. A 2013 study by the United Nations said that more than 99% of Egyptian women have been subjected to some form of sexual abuse at least once in their lives.
Gunmen in Yemen attacked key power lines in the eastern province of Ma'rib, suspending the entire national energy grid and plunging the country into total darkness.
As if life in Yemen wasn't complicated enough. Now even electricity has been shut down. The blackout is the result of a militant attack which sabotaged key power lines in the eastern province of Ma'rib, suspending the entire national power and energy grid. The absence of a reliable electricity supply further complicates the lives of Yemenis, who already suffer from water and food shortages.
The food can't be kept for a long time as the refrigerator doesn't work, so we have to throw it away.
This is the third time this month that power lines in Marib have come under attack by armed militants.
Life is being affected by all means due to the cut-off power, especially on the medical side, either in hospitals, pharmacies or any other place. Many people die in hospitals because of the lack of power, and many pharmacists see their medicine expire due to no power. Whoever does that is committing a crime.
All our tools need to be supplied by power, and the continuity of losing power causes us a very heavy burden.
To make matters worse, Sana'a residents have also faced severe fuel shortages for weeks, with many homes and businesses having to rely on generators. Attacks on power lines in Yemen are common and are often launched by heavily armed tribesmen as a lever to press for the release of jailed relatives or to support other demands. Few in Yemen are expecting the lights to come back on permanently, as the ongoing violence and political crisis continue to plague the country.
Pakistan's Karachi airport came under attack again, one day after a brazen Taliban assault left at least 37 people dead. Gunmen have briefly engaged in firefights with troops following government-launched airstrikes which killed 15 militants elsewhere in the country.
Flights from Karachi airport have been cancelled again, but there was no weather storm in the Pakistani city, only thundering gunfire and fuming fires. One day after a Taliban assault on the airport killed at least 37 people, gunmen took another shot at attacking the compound but failed to repeat Monday's carnage. Militants attacked a security post near Pakistan's Karachi airport and exchanged fire with troops, who ended the operation without inflicting casualties. Earlier in the day, the Pakistani Air Force launched airstrikes in the militant-infested tribal district of Khyber, killing at least 15 members of the Taliban and destroying a number of their hideouts. The death toll from Monday's events had stood at 30 before the bodies of 7 workers who were hiding in here during the clashes were recovered. They were charred beyond recognition.
It is very sad. These 7 lives that were lost could have been saved if action had been taken on time.
But it appears authorities were a little bit too late. The country's security forces constantly find themselves in the public eye, and it was no different after the latest bloodshed. Many directed their condemnation at the government's negligence instead of the Taliban. Others were just thankful.
If our army and rangers had not overcome them, they would have destroyed the entire airport and airplanes worth billions of rupees.
Tehreek al-Taliban Pakistan has claimed responsibility for the deadly siege on the airport, saying it was a revenge attack for the killing of its leader, Hakimullah Mahsoud, last year. While the corpses of the victims of the airport attack were shrouded and taken to their final resting place, the peace process, which began in February between the Pakistani government and the Taliban, is all but dead. Many fear that this attack is only the beginning of the resurrection of the extremist group.
Here's a reminder of our top stories. Militants from the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant invade parts of Iraq's Kirkuk and Salah ad-Din provinces after occupying the second city of Mosul. Iraq's Prime Minister declares a nationwide state of emergency, saying that the government is prepared to counter the terrorist offensive. The death toll from the ongoing infighting between rival militant groups in Syria climbs to over 600. And the Israeli Knesset approves a law enabling the forced feeding of Palestinian hunger-striking detainees. Well, that's all from me and the Al Hijah News team. Thank you very much for watching and good night.